That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
We've got a little lost in translation moment here. Alex Aniel is an American writer who works in Japan in a bunch of different capacities. You're also a translator when needed to be.
Yeah.
You helped us out on a shoot just recently, which is amazing. You also work with limited run games to help bring some independently produced titles into a limited run kind of capacity out there.
Yes.
But the reason why we're talking to Alex today, you're working on a Resident Evil book.
Yeah, I actually just finished writing a Resident Evil development history called An Itchy, Tasty History of Resident Evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent 2 years talking with a lot of the developers of the first few Resident Evil games from 1 through 4, including the directors and the producers. And it was a really interesting experience, and because I speak Japanese, I was able to talk to them directly myself and kind of get a feel for what things were like when they were making each and every Resident Evil game. I think it's an interesting story, and I think people will definitely enjoy reading it once it comes out.
Hell yeah, it is. And one of the things that I think is really cool about your approach, we were talking off camera, is that you're not really trying to make the coffee table history of Resident Evil. You're trying to talk with the humans involved and the people involved, which is what EP is all about with our show. So I totally get what you're putting together here. But just give me an anecdote. Give me a sense of one of the discoveries that you were maybe surprised by or pleased by in your conversations with these different people.
I mean, just anecdotally, in terms of like Resident Evil 2, for example, that's a unique game because it was a 2-disc game.
Mm-hmm.
But I found out from the director himself, Hideki Kamiya, that wasn't actually the plan originally. And Resident Evil 2, like the other games in the series early on, was supposed to be a 1-disc game. But apparently one of the audio engineers or the sound programmers made a mistake with something related to the game's like audio algorithms and how it handles data size and compression.
Yeah.
And so this was not discovered until maybe too late in development to go back and fix it. So they decided to make it a 2-disc game instead.
Which ups the production costs immensely, yes.
Bigger case, heavier packaging.
Right.
There was some element of reprogramming involved in that as well.
Was the audio guy fired or was
no.
It was okay? Yeah.
Well, it actually ended up working to their favor because it made Resident Evil 2 look like a much bigger game than the original. So it was one of those beautiful accidents that really only people who worked on the game can really know about, and the book has quite a bit of that.
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down!
And how far into the series are you going? You're doing 1 to 4, or are you going all the way up to 7? How far are you going?
The book right now is broken up into 2 parts.
Mm-hmm.
Part 1 is finished.
Okay.
And part 1 goes for the first 10 to 12 years of the series.
Yep.
So right up to Resident Evil 4.
Okay.
And a little bit after that, because I think that's kind of a nice divide.
Yes.
Because most of the primary
They
creators-
lost their way for a little bit after that, didn't they?
They did, yeah. And I would attribute that partially to the fact that it was new people working on it
Yes.
who would kind of bring their own approach to the Resident Evil series, and I think it took them a while to kind of settle on the direction, especially after a game like Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, and also the climate at that time too was very different. The video game sort of consumer was a different person, and people were looking for edgier action stuff.
I would say it was a combination of having to follow up on Resident Evil 4 of all games.
Yes.
Change of creators. That was the era when we were starting to get into HD gaming,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of like development tools were advancing, but also becoming more standardized.
Right.
And
Gears of War became such a huge
Gears of War, yeah.
phenomenon that I think so many companies were either trying to emulate it or they were scared of it or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Wii
Which is so funny because Gears was directly influenced by Resident Evil.
Oh yeah, directly.
Yeah.
I think Cliff Bleszinski attributes Resident Evil 4 as one of his most influential games, I think.
For sure.
The Wii had popped up, so that presented an opportunity for the industry to change a lot. So I think that a combination of a lot of different things, meeting different expectations, really made Resident Evil kind of an interesting thing to look at in terms of how to transition a property from one phase into another.
Now, did you interview any of the developers at Capcom that are still there, that have been working in and around Resident Evil this whole time?
Yeah, somewhat.
Yeah.
There's a lot of informality behind the people I've spoken to who are still at Capcom, because there's
You're doing this as your own story.
Yeah,
You're not
and
doing
it's
this as the official book from Capcom.
Yes, it's an independent project, and I think it's better that way.
Yeah.
I'm not here to embarrass the company, or I'm not here to reveal dirty secrets. It's more telling a story with a human angle to it.
Yeah.
About what it took to make a Resident Evil game. Every Resident Evil game has a very different history, but there's a lot of commonality.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk to the developers, I usually just ask them, all right, tell me a story. Most interviews are like, okay, what did you do here? What did you do with that? Why did you come up with this idea?
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that in my approach, but I left a lot of the storytelling to them.
Right.
I told them, all right, from the beginning, start here with how this game got greenlit.
Cool.
Talk about some of the people you worked with. Talk about what else was going on in the industry. One of the most interesting discoveries I made was that the impetus to bring Resident Evil, there was an NES game, a Famicom game in Japan called Sweet Home, based on a Japanese movie in the 80s, but that was probably one of the first survival horror games as we understand it today. And being on the Famicom, the NES, the creator couldn't really realize the vision that he had for the idea of a survival horror game. But then when he saw Virtua Fighter and Star Fox running as polygonal games on the arcade and on the Super Nintendo, that was his spark to finally, go back and see if there was a potential to bring Sweet Home back as a 3D franchise for the PlayStation 32-bit hardware. Of course, being a movie IP, they couldn't use the Sweet Home name again, but they decided to come up with their own original IP, which was, in fact, Resident Evil, or Biohazard, as they call it here.
Nice.
So it's things like that. People, I don't know anyone who would, innately be able to draw a comparison or a connection between Virtua Fighter and Resident Evil, or Star Fox and Resident Evil.
Right.
But when you ask the creators, what inspired you? You might hear 9 times out of 10, the movie The Thing, or Alfred Hitchcock or Psycho or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You might hear that, but if you ask carefully, or if you ask them to tell like a complete story from beginning to end, you might
go back into their minds and their imaginations and memories.
Yeah, you'll get Virtua Fighter. I thought I knew a lot about Resident Evil before I started this project, and then I realized I actually didn't know that much.
Cool.
A lot of my knowledge was very superficial, so
Right.
I'm really glad that I was able to get these stories on paper.
That's what I was going to say.
Did they know that Resident Evil was going to be a success when the first game was made? Did they know that this was going to become a franchise like that?
Yeah, everyone who I've asked this question has had the same answer,
Yeah.
and pretty much no one had terribly high expectations for it, both from a commercial and critical standpoint. People thought the game would be okay, maybe mediocre, maybe it might sell, a couple thousand copies. That's it. There was very little expectation that it would eventually become Capcom's leading game IP.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's kind of the Capcom story in a lot of ways. Street Fighter, Mega Man, Monster Hunter.
Yeah.
No one makes these games with the presumption that they'll become big properties that will last 10, 20, 30 years. They have a word for it, like at Capcom actually. They call them the kamikazes.
Mm-hmm.
People might know that as a war term,
Yeah.
but the original meaning is like divine wind. It means like a big storm comes in, and it might be kind of chaotic, but it also has a benefit to it. That's the story of Resident Evil in a nutshell.
Your favorite one is 4?
I would say 4, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of waver sometimes, and there are a few different styles of Resident Evil. I think overall 4 might be my favorite, because that was definitely like a very revolutionary game. It was beautiful when it came out, like it defied all my expectations. The development of 4 is actually quite fascinating in and of itself, because that was inherited from a game that got canceled, right? And they had to change directors, change teams, change direction, all within, by today's standards, a fairly short period of time. Resident Evil 4 is definitely one of the miraculous games to come out of the series.
You're in the video game community and the industry, and you know people at all kinds of development studios, and you're working with musicians and all kinds of. What do you know about video game making now that maybe you didn't before you took this leap in your career and decided to move to Japan?
Yeah, it's just, I think it's a miracle video games come out at all. Unless you're maybe one of those one man or one woman indie teams,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
there are just so many cogs that are moving in this machine, and everybody has a different opinion.
Yeah.
And when you're making games for global audiences, you have to multiply that by, multiples of, I don't know, powers of 10. It's just uncountable how much variance there is. And I feel like at each step of the way, there's always the potential for something somewhere to go wrong.
Yes.
And things do go wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it's remarkable how, no matter what game comes out from what publisher, whether it's a good game or a bad game, or whether it's a game that sells well or does not sell well, I think it's a miracle that these things exist. And a lot of times they're born not because people want to make money or they want to become rich or famous, especially with Resident Evil's creators. Like, none of them did it to become famous, right?
Yeah.
Or prominent. They do it because they like making games, and that's their creative output. They see it as a job first and foremost, very typical of Japan. But it's a way for them to realize what they have going on creatively in their minds, and it's a miracle. I think everybody should be grateful for every video game that they buy and all the people that made it.
When can people get the book?
So right now I'm working with a UK publisher called Unbound, and their approach is unique because they crowdfund books.
Yep.
So they have a website, unbound.com. They launched campaigns for upcoming books by authors like myself, like other crowdfunding websites. There are different tiers where you can back like an ebook, book with a special cover, book that's signed, free poster or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's all up now. And there is no official deadline, so there's no pressure to back now or forever hold your peace kind of deal.
Right.
We're a little bit over halfway there, which is great because we gave ourselves a 6-month window to kind of see where this was going to go. We know there's a very, perhaps relatively small, but very passionate fan base for video game literature, so I think fans will really appreciate that, and I hope that we can hit the 100% goal before long.
I think you will. I mean, the fan base for video game literature might be small-ish, but the fans for Resident Evil are voracious, and they want to know everything. And you've had access to everybody that's worked on them, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So people can find it at unbound.com.
Unbound.com.
And what's the name of the book?
So, An Itchy, Tasty History of Resident Evil.
Right on, Alex. Good luck with this.
Thank you.
I can't wait to read it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Thanks. Maybe I'll need it.